organize. So let me begin my presentation with an introduction in which I said that I begin my presentation by showing you two images that have a very important point in common. They are the images that Laszlo Moholy-Nagy placed at the very end of two of the three books that he published in the series of the Bauhaus Bücher, the book series that he co-edited with Walter Gropius between 1923 and 1929. On the one hand, we find the four images that appear in the last double page of Malerei Fotografie Film, painting photography film, published in the first version in 1925 and then in a second, slightly revised one in 1927. These images show, on the one hand, two photograms of a film, and on the other side, a photographic portrait and a fingerprint, all presented as examples of a telegraphic transmission of images, in some cases, the one on the right, of a wireless, drahtlos telegraphic transmission. And I will, of course, return to them at length in what follows. On the other hand, we find the single image that appears at the end of the book Von Material zur Architektur, From Material to Architecture, which was actually translated as The New Vision and published in various versions, slightly different from the German one, beginning with 1938. In this case, the last image is this one. It is an image that shows some buildings which appear as superimposed onto one another through multiple exposures and through the passage from positive to negative. Now, what interests me in all these images that Moholy-Nagy placed at the end of these very two important volumes that he published while he was at the Bauhaus is the fact that in both cases they seem to visualize what Moholy-Nagy considered as the horizon, the end point towards which a teleologically oriented history of technical media was directed. On the one hand, we have the horizon of the wireless transmission of images, a condition in which all the different material supports of images, be they traditional ones such as canvas, wood, and paper, or new ones, such as the various synthetic surfaces with which Moholy-Nagy experienced throughout his artistic career, such as galalith, silverite, rhodoid, perspex, plexiglass, celluloid, and so on. The horizon in which all these supports are replaced by electricity as the fundamental carrier of light signals. On the other hand, in the last image of Von Material zur Architektur, we find another vision of the horizon of the history of technical media. In this case, the horizon is represented by the dissolution, the dematerialization of the opacity and the concreteness of materials and techniques into a light-filled atmosphere. Behind these two phenomena, which, as I said, Moholy-Nagy presented to his readers as the end point of a teleologically oriented history of media, there's a key belief that runs throughout his entire artistic trajectory. The idea, as he writes in an essay published in 1923 in English in the avant-garde journal Broom, that light is the fundamental medium of plastic expression, and that the nature of light is that of a material that is almost immaterial. As he writes in another essay written in 1929, entitled in German Photogramm und Grenzgebiete, Photogram and Frontier Zones, light was for Moholy-Nagy a nearly insubstantial material, ein fast wesenslos Material. A closer analysis to the context in which these images I just showed you I placed in the two books will allow me to further substantiate this idea. I will begin first with Malerei Fotografie Film and then continue with Von Material zur Architektur. Before I do it, though, I'd like to underline that whether for the second book we have in French a very good translation, an edition that replicates the original layout, even though not the cover, and respects the importance of Moholy-Nagy's graphic design, for the second book we just have the Gallimard Folio edition, Peinture, Photographie, Film et autres essais sur la photographie. In this second case, the publisher decided to publish only Moholy-Nagy's text, as if this could be separated from the graphic layout and, most importantly, from the whole iconographic section. This section, of which I show you here just 2 of the 70 pages of images, was carefully organized by Moholy-Nagy through a principle of montage that he used as a way to interpret the main lines of development within the visual culture of the 1920s. Taken together, this section of Maleraille Photographie Film acted as a sort of small exhibition within the book and prepared the way for the work that Moholy-Nagy would do a couple of years later for the exhibition Film und Foto in 1929, for which he curated the famous first section, the Raum 1, with the title Wohin geht die photographische Entwicklung? Where is the photographic development heading? So let me move to my first section, actually second, wireless transmission in Maleraille Photographie Film. Maleraille Photographie Film is a book organized in 2 parts, both of which are preceded by a statement, a sort of a slogan, that indicates the lines of teleological development that Moholy-Nagy saw in the artistic uses of media that surrounded him. This is both a kind of an observational statement, but also sort of a normative one. It's an encouragement to go in this direction, which is the direction that moves from painting with pigment to light displays projected with a reflector. The first part of the book, a text divided in 12 small sections, tackles crucial issues, such as the relationship between painting and photography, the difference between productive and reproductive approaches to the artistic use of technical media, the cameraless photographic technique that Moholy-Nagy called the photogram, the typo photo as a new medium combining typography and photography, a medium which Moholy-Nagy used for the presentation of his project for a film entitled The Dynamik der Großstadt, of which you see on the right page, and the polykino, the simultaneous or polycinema, a concave semi-spherical screen onto which Moholy-Nagy imagined that several films could be projected at once, as you can see in the diagram on the right. Across the 12 sections of the text, we find some key ideas that help us contextualize the choice of the 2 final images with examples of telegraphic and wirelessly telegraphed transmission of images. First, the idea that all the artistic forms of visual gestaltung, a key term to understand Moholy-Nagy's theory, which means configuring, giving form to, shaping, and which is often erroneously translated with creating. Gestaltung, according to Moholy-Nagy, should use technical means that are contemporary to the period in which Gestaltung is performed. Since each historical period, writes Moholy-Nagy, has its own optical focus, its own optical stance, optische Einstellung. Second, the idea that the most contemporary art forms are the ones which work with projected light, either by projecting light towards a photosensitive surface, such as that of the photogram, or by projecting light directly towards the sky, towards the clouds, for example, an idea that Moholy-Nagy continues to imagine throughout his later writings of the 30s and 40s. Thirdly, the idea that electricity, can become the medium that can separate light from its natural carrier, which for Moholy-Nagy was the ether, and become the universal carrier of both light and sound, in such a way that, writes Moholy-Nagy, optics would become a special province of the theory of electricity. Finally, the possibility of developing in the near future what Moholy-Nagy calls a radio picture service, Radiobilderdienst, which would further enhance the widespread proliferation and the immediate accessibility of images that he comments in the section of the book entitled House Pinakothek, Domestic Picture Galleries, with phrases that reminds us of the idea of the distribution de la réalité sensible à domicile that we find in Paul Valéry's La Conquête de l'ubiquité, published a year later in 1928. And actually, an interesting point, but I don't have an answer, is whether Paul Valéry knew of Moholy-Nagy's text published a year before, with this idea of the domestic pinakothek. Now, it is important to remind that all these ideas about the need for contemporary technical means of artistic production, about the importance of pursuing art forms based on light projection and on electric or even wireless transmission, were formulated by an artist who a few years before writing Malerai photography film had already experimented with the possibility of generating images from a distance. I'm referring, of course, to his famous Telefonbilder, produced in 1923 in 3 different formats and with 3 different titles, EM1, EM2, and EM3. In these photographs, we see them hanging in the Gallery Der Sturm, where they were presented in Berlin in 1924. Now, going back to Malerai photography film, the second half of the book contains 70 pages, with a carefully constructed sequence, montage sequence of images, each of which is accompanied by a caption. This illustrated section of the book ends with a double page, which seems to synthesize all the ideas I just summarized. In it, we find 4 examples that Moholy-Nagy selected from the experiments of Arthur Korn, a German physicist whose name is linked to the technique of Bildtelegraphy, the transmission of photographs through electric signals using telephone or telegraphic lines. In 1904, Korn successfully transmitted an image through telephone cables from Munich to Nuremberg. In 1906, a photographic portrait was sent to a location 1,800 kilometers away from the starting point, while in 1907, it was an image of the Kaiser to be transmitted. In 1913, Korn demonstrated the first successful visual telegraphic transmission of a cinematic recording. Now, the images that Moholy-Nagy selects for the end of Malerai photography film stem exactly from these experiments by Korn. On the left, we see 2 photographs of a film, an example, as he says, of a telegrafiertes Kino, of a telegraphed cinema, showing a quintessential, iconic cinematographic image, the arrival of a train, perhaps a direct reference to the famous Lumière film L'arrivée d'un train en gare de la Ciotat. On the right, we find instead a photographic portrait and a fingerprint, 2 images that are presented here as drahtlos telegrafiert, so wirelessly telegraphed, and which point to some of the possible non-artistic uses of wire photography, for example, in relation to police searches and so on, which would actually had led already in the 1910s to the telegraphic transmission of mugshots of suspected criminals. Now, if every historical period, according to Moholy-Nagy, had its own optical focus, its own optical stance, the 1920s were for him, I quote him, the age of film, of the electric sign, of the simultaneity of sensorially perceptible events. And in this sense, the images taken from Korn's Bildtelegrafie announced for him a future of a Radiobilderdienst, a way of enhancing the simultaneity and the ubiquity of visual perception, which was destined for him to profoundly transform a visual culture and the production, reproduction, transmission, and reception of images. Let me now move to von Material zu Architektur. What we find at the end of this book, as I show you, is a photographic image that shows a series of modern and traditional buildings and that turns their facades into transparent, mutually interpenetrating volumes through 2 different techniques. On the one hand, the passage from positive to negative, and on the other, the use of multiple exposures. Moholy-Nagy's caption further emphasizes this impression of transparency, connecting it to the new domain of glass architecture. What we write in the caption below in German is, the illusion of spatial interpenetration is secured by superimposing two photographic negatives. The next generation will perhaps really see buildings like these with glass architecture. And it's important to notice that this kind of 1920s glass architecture was fundamentally different from the one that Paul Scherbart imagined in his Glass Architektur in 1914, and from the kind of expressionistic and visionary visions of Bruno Taut in his books at the end of the 1910s. Now, just as it happened with the images that Moholy-Nagy placed at the end of Malerei photography film, these images well represents the teleological goal towards which the whole book of Von Materialsarchitektur is directed. This goal consists in the dissolution and the dematerialization of the concreteness and the opacity of materials and techniques into the openness and transparency of a light-filled atmosphere. Now, I'd like to also underline that dematerialization is not a term that I'm using here to comment Moholy-Nagy, but it's a term that he himself uses, Entmaterialisierung, together with other terms such as Sublimierung, sublimation, overcoming of materials, Überwinden, or also dispersion, Auflockerung. In the book, I will now skip a little bit my text to go faster. The book presents this sort of teleologic progress towards the materialization, which is in a way kind of pre-announced by this cover, which already plays with glass and projections and shadows. The book has a whole construction in different sections. The section 2 is entitled Das Material. Section 3 is entitled Der weitere Weg des Materials, das Volumen, the further way of the materials, the volume. And here we see a whole progress from very solid full volumes to volumes that begin to be modeled, that begin to be perforated, hollowed out, to volumes that actually hang and begin to oscillate and move, as if the drive was towards a sort of defying of gravitational forces. And in this last section, the notion of moving volumes extends also to images that show light projected in the night sky with fireworks, with moving lights in amusement parks, with night lights captured by night photography, as in the image below, and also this kind of powerful light projections onto the surfaces of buildings. Now, what Moholy-Nagy saw in his book was an overall tendency that cut across all art forms and that shared a common drive towards motion, light, the ether, and the atmosphere. He writes, in painting, from colored pigment to light, colored light plays. In music, from instrumental tone to color tone, ether wave music, with which I think he is referring to the theremin, by the way. In poetry, from the national bound, from the event-centered language, from thought construction and feeling construction to unbound absolute poetry. In architecture, from closed to open space, from bound interior space to absolute space. And this idea of an opening of space is, of course, what we find in the last section of the book, the Raumarchitektur, the space architecture, which culminates with this image, but which also contains images of this project by Moholy-Nagy from 1922, and then various images of examples of glass architecture, both in the technical industrial domain and in the stage design and his own, Moholy-Nagy's own stage design. So let me now move to my conclusions, and this will take 1 minute, so I will stay. Often presented as a new form of materialism, one that highlights the role played by the material and technical infrastructures of perception, knowledge, and communication, theories of media throughout the 20th century and up to the present have been repeatedly fascinated by the idea of dematerialization. More precisely, they have often promoted a vision of the history of technical media as a process teleologically oriented towards a future characterized by the overcoming of the weight, the opaqueness, and the resistance of materiality, and by the advent of new pervasive forms of instantaneous, ubiquitous communication. Light, be it natural or artificial, has often played a key role in this historical narrative. With its symbolic connotations, its diffused presence, its limitless plasticity, its ultimate speed, its ambiguous status between infinitely small particles and electromagnetic waves, its crucial role in the transmission of images and signals, light has often raised the question of the materiality of media themselves, pointing to the possibility of immediacy, of an immediate, instantaneous, immaterial transmission. The writings and works of Moholy-Nagy play a key role in this narrative. His vision of a broad tendency of all art forms towards light, transparency, and dematerialization runs across all his main texts. From the short manifesto entitled Dynamisch Konstruktives Kraftsystem, Dynamic Constructive System of Forces, written with Khomeini in 1922, to his posthumous book Vision in Motion from 1947. For him, light, be it natural, artificial, recorded, or projected, was at the same time a nearly insubstantial material and a fundamental medium of plastic expression. A medium in the double sense of an artistic material and an all-encompassing surrounding substance that could be modulated and modified at will, allowing media and art forms such as painting, photography, film, sculpture, and architecture to show the path towards a gradual dissolution of everything material and opaque into the openness and the transparency of the atmosphere. Thank you.